And now, a live recording of the hit Off the Chain podcast. Please welcome Morgan Creek Digital Managing Partner Anthony Pompliano with a fireside chat with the former lead of JP Morgan's Ethereum-based Quorum and now CEO and co-founder of Clovyr, Amber Baldet.
All right, guys. Amber's sick. We're going to get this out of the way.
Hello, everyone.
She's going to do her best. We've got 25 minutes. First of all, thank you for doing this.
Absolutely.
For those that don't know, maybe let's just start with your background and kind of how you got into crypto originally, and then let's go from there.
Okay. Who are you? So I had worked in financial technology, I guess, for my entire career. I started out working at a research boutique, which had a trading desk. And what they did is they issued mostly sell recommendations, so mostly essentially shorts, although they wouldn't call them that. And so what they were doing was fundamental research about biotech, tech, pharma, and special situations. So for example, when I was an intern, I helped them write a presentation about why you should short Countrywide in 2004.
That ended up being a good decision.
You do not want, they were right, but not right at the right time. But it was a really important entree into thinking about what the checks and balances in our financial system are. And that if there's nobody out there that's not just yelling buy, buy, buy all the time, then the FDA approves things that kill people sometimes. And so I was really interested in that, and then moved to New York and ultimately ended up at JP Morgan.
And I know you can't say too much about the JP Morgan experience, but anything there that kind of sticks out in terms of having gone from outside a major bank into one of these banks and then leaving for blockchain?
Well, in the interim between the research firm and JP Morgan, I was at Old Lane, which was Vikram Pandit's hedge fund. And I was doing business process reengineering for them. And they also went massively, massively belly up when Lehman collapsed. I remember watching the Citi, we used to track whether or not Citi stock was worth a pack of cigarettes. Like, it was not that way when we started. And so coming out of that and then trying to just repeatedly feel like if it's just the year that you're born or what it is, but that you end up in this kind of crest or trough of financial cycles your entire career. And I just felt like, man, I just cannot catch a break. Like everywhere I work is like collapses. So I did not manage to take JPM down, so that's good. But I think that in that instance, I worked in a number of different departments there. And most importantly, their new product development team, which is doing some really cool innovation work. But eventually kind of just got to the point where I said I would like to go back to just doing like real low-level tech stuff. And there's just so much that has to be done to make the decentralized systems kind of things that we're talking about viable, not just in business, but I think in the consumer space as well. And so that's what I'm doing now.
And before we get into what you're actually building right now, let's talk a little bit about kind of privacy and decentralization and how you see the gaps. Like what are the big areas that need to be pushed forward in order for us to achieve what I think everyone in the room, is hoping that we can get to?
Yeah, privacy is a bit of a quagmire. I'm on the board of the Zcash Foundation. I care deeply about privacy and things, but I think that I feel like we've almost gone off the other deep end in this community now a little bit, where people are asking, how can I validate that like no information has ever left my computer? I'm like, well, you could just disconnect it from the internet and run a regular old computer program the way we used to. Like, we didn't used to connect everything to the internet. But there's a difference between privacy, which is kind of the freedom from intrusion, and confidentiality, which is making sure that the people that you authorize to see your private information use it in a consensual manner. So you might use Signal as your messenger, hopefully, But you cannot prevent someone from taking a picture of whatever you said on Signal with a different phone, whether or not screenshots are disabled. You always have to trust the person on the other end of the line. And so we've kind of gotten into this, this space of throwing zero-knowledge proofs at everything and trying to say we're going to have a trust minimized or trustless, completely private kind of, it sounds very dystopian, when what we should have been thinking about is more about how we can increase the accountability of the systems that we have, see how our information that we gave consensually to vendors that we want to work with is being used, and change some of the incentivization models that are forcing these companies, startups specifically, but large companies too, to collect and track and take so much data and to drive their metrics because they're being demanded to share those metrics with investors.
How much of this is privacy by design, right? Or like, I always think of it kind of as functional privacy, right? So there's a level of privacy that you and I should both expect when we use certain products, but also it has to be functional enough so that the friction doesn't prevent us from using it. Like, I don't know if you've ever used, was it Confide? So you can prevent the screenshot, but you have to drag your finger over the words. It's not horrible, but that's added friction compared to Signal, which is supposed to provide 90% of the same privacy. How do you think about that, like, user experience and friction while also thinking about privacy?
I think that what's important to understand is your threat model and who you're trying to keep private from what, or what you're trying to keep private from whom. But if you look at something like Signal, when they were subpoenaed basically to provide a bunch of user records, and they turned over all the metadata that they had, which simply was none. That's privacy by design. It's not jumping through a bunch of hoops to make your users recognize how private their stuff is. Most people are not asking for privacy. And we need to build applications that don't require people to care about their privacy, but empower them to still keep things private.
And before we get to Clovyr, privacy by design I think of as you're building from day one with this in mind. How difficult is it for companies that already have products out there that were not designed that way, who have large user bases, to kind of decentralize or kind of become pro-privacy? Can they actually erode or evolve from where they are to kind of, if they had built it that way from scratch, or is it just too big of a hurdle for them to be able to kind of evolve that way?
That's a good question. I mean, again, the incentives don't seem to align for anyone to ever give away their data. I think businesses now are starting to realize that this kind of data lake mentality that they had of pulling everything together and dumping it in one central place so that you can run ML algorithms over it, that creates a lot of technical risk. It creates data breach risk. But it creates a legal risk as well for you now. And so they're looking at different ways to be able to derive that same kind of business insight that you would get out of a centralized data lake without actually having said data lake. And that is an interesting application of distributed systems that's not necessarily about a blockchain, but is about being able to do things like secure multi-party compute or federated learning and things that I think is going to really find traction in the business space.
Got it. And maybe for those that don't know, let's talk about Clovyr and kind of what you're building there. What's the goal, or like why start a company to go after this?
Yeah.
She's still trying to figure that out.
I'm still figuring it out. So I think the challenges that my co-founder and I were looking at last year when we kind of announced we were doing this thing are exactly the same as they are this year. I think what has evolved for us is digging into the problems. As you dig into the problems, you realize we have to go deeper, you have to go lower. Like I started thinking that it was going to be easy to kind of to fill in this kind of middle layer that was just really missing to connect applications that people were building, whether they're business dApps or otherwise, like kind of up at the top layer with these underlying ledgers, say Enterprise Ethereum or otherwise. And yes, there is a whole missing technical layer that's Salesforce for the blockchain in the middle there. But I realized pretty early on that you can't have decentralized applications with completely centralized infrastructure. And we're seeing this problem more and more. I mean, Ethereum as well, like we're aware of the Infura situation, you know, and that given the choice between convenience and rolling your own or doing your own thing, a lot of people will choose convenience. So we realized, what is it that we need to do? And businesses do the same thing. I'm not trying to pick on it in Infura, but what is it that we need to do to make sure that the people that we're working for, who in this case on the enterprise side are corporates. I don't work for a protocol, I don't work for a tech stack, I don't work for a platform, right? So if we're talking to these corporates, what is it that they actually want? They want to avoid lock-in, they want to be in charge of their own destiny, they want to reduce the amount of vendor stickiness that they've had, they want to be able to connect to peers that are running completely different stacks than them, and that's complicated. And similarly on the public side, I would look at, I mentioned Ethereum, but it's similar in the Bitcoin space. If you say, well, just go run your own node, it turns out like that's kind of hard to do. We were talking about this beforehand. And so if you go back 10 or 15 years, people used to run their own websites. Shocking. People used to run their own blogs. People used to maybe even run their own email servers. I ran my own email server like 20 years ago. We don't do that anymore for good reasons on the email side. Security-wise, spam-wise, it's a wreck. You wouldn't want to do that. But when you look at something like blogs, the aggregation of all of this into Medium is potentially a problem when you start deplatforming people. And similarly, looking at what's happening with Patreon or all these other kind of platforms, where people no longer self-host. And so figuring out a way that we can provide what feels like a cloud experience, or in developer DevOps speak now, a serverless experience, but with the same agency of actual self-hosted applications, is like nobody's really done that before. And doing that allows us to solve so many problems on the business side, but also like really help people that want to build disruptive things on the public side.
Yeah, I mean, look, when companies were first getting started in the mid-90s, right, they literally had to raise so much money because they had to buy servers, they had to run them in the closet in the house where they were building the company. They had more control, but there was an economic disadvantage to today, and also a psychological one, right? I mean, how many problems do you have with AWS versus the servers in your closet? Big difference. This idea that you have around, you can't have decentralized applications running on centralized services. How pervasive is that problem, right? So if you think of, there's a lot of people who say, hey, there's decentralized applications or there's decentralized protocols, but they're just running on an AWS, for example, right? Like, do you see that as a huge issue, or is that overblown at this point in terms of, let's say Amazon's kind of centralization of crypto in general across all the platforms?
I think that it's a huge problem. I think it's an underestimated problem, not an overestimated one. The thing about the major clouds is that they need to get customers for their cloud. That's what they do. That's their job. But compute and storage is a commodity. And so they're facing an ongoing commoditization of their business, where they're trying to figure out how to continue to drive adoption and usage of that, and how to keep people from going to places like, even if you look at something like DigitalOcean or Linode, or places that will offer like much, much cheaper hosting without all the fancy bells and whistles, for a lot of people, they don't necessarily need all those bells and whistles. And so, yeah, we've kind of, made this thing that lets you deploy to really any host that you have with one line. And we didn't have to partner with the cloud to do that. You can use any major cloud, or you can use your own box in your basement if you want. You can use your own on-premises like hybrid cloud solution if you're an enterprise. I think infrastructure agency is one of these things where individuals and businesses have a surprising amount of crossover in what they actually want out of the world. They want to be able to not have that kind of intrusion, and they want to run their own thing, but you can't. No more than anybody wants to run email in their basement anymore. You can't expect people to take on that amount of responsibility, and telling them, well, oh, just do it yourself is not going to help anyone adopt anything.
How much of the decentralization of the infrastructure itself is about, we were talking earlier about like unstoppable domains or unstoppable servers, et cetera, versus that's maybe the extreme, implementation of this, and that's unlikely to be where most of the value accrues?
Yeah, I mean, if you had your own blog and you put it on DreamHost or GoDaddy or whatever, and you ran it, nobody's going to shut you down for anything. So the more people that were running their own thing, it's not like we all started out with a decentralized blockchain network it's not a DApp, it's just somebody doing their own thing. But the reasons that we don't do that anymore, which we've already talked about with the convenience and the discoverability of something like Medium, which is huge, the discoverability aspect, you don't get that when you just drop your blog into the world from your own host these days. So these are the challenges that we have to solve. There's the ease of having people be able to do something like self-hosting, and the discoverability of being able to find things that are like them. Doing discoverability in a decentralized way is incredibly challenging, for privacy reasons, as you're mentioning, but also because you end up having to kind of do peer discovery to know who likes what, and like who is like me. Like the idea of the kind of Netflixy style groupings of things that like, you're gonna like this, you might like this, and then at the end of the day, now they don't care what you like anymore though, it's just Netflix released this and you're gonna watch it. Right? So that
they tell you what's popular.
Right? Which totally is the thing about co-opting the algorithm there. But in order to learn, you can do that sort of like machine learning locally, but you cannot share information with other people very well without having centralized kind of intermediary pubs. You can see like Scuttlebutt actually is a good example of this. So Secure Scuttlebutt sits under a chat platform as well, but they had the idea of a pub server, where a pub server is essentially always online and allows people to kind of connect, and then it distributes out information. But otherwise, if you and I were to connect, it's kind of like Facebook, like we would connect locally here and our information would never be shared more broadly. So it's how do you handle discovery that is super complicated.
Well, and to me, it feels like we've done a great job training entrepreneurs and corporations, so both the challengers and the incumbents. Data is valuable, right? And so we use this for recommendation engines, we use this for search results, we use it for monetization. We've kind of incentivized people, if you get the data, you can drive value. When we take that away from them, right, as a centralized entity or corporation, how do the business models get affected, right? How do the products themselves get affected? If Netflix doesn't have access to that data, or Facebook can no longer target ads as well, like where does this bring us from the entrepreneur or the corporation seat?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly something to be said for the interesting types of content that have come out of having access to things like the Netflix data. But there were actually a couple hackathons that they did on anonymized Netflix data, where they said, try to de-anonymize this data. Because to their credit, they say, we're anonymizing it, and we're not trying to tell, you, Jim in Oregon, exactly what to watch. We're trying to kind of do this in aggregate for a consumer archetype. But it turns out that you can cross-reference anonymized data sets relatively trivially. And so simple anonymization techniques just are not enough. There's not really a safe way to do this, especially if you start adding in location data and things. But to your point about how the business models change, I mean, we have to assume that anything that these companies, we are subsidized, right? Like, we are simply not paying for the value of what we're taking. And I'm not sure that people that have not paid for something will start paying for something. But I think that we also underestimate what it's like to have an entire new generation figuring out how to monetize their like Instagram likes, or I don't know what it is, like TikTok or whatever. I don't know, I'm old. But like the kids are fine. They're figuring out how to do stuff. Like the gig economy is probably even worse than the sharing economy for people that will not have insurance in America. And they're going to need to come up with different business models to figure out how to live. The idea that like people are going to have these corporate jobs is just fading for this entire generation. And so I think that we shouldn't underestimate how many disruptive ideas this younger generation has, and they will pay for stuff. Even if you look at like the revenue of the music industry over the last 15 years, a majority of people under 25 now pay for music. And what was the argument all along? No one will pay for it. We all do just torrent it. And that's not true at all. People want to support artists. They want to pay for it. And, I don't think it's as dystopian as we think.
Well, and it's a combination, I think, right? Because the consumer trend changed because of technology. So you went from CDs to this digital format. When the digital format came, all of a sudden people were like, oh, I can get it for free. And it took some time for entrepreneurs to figure out, okay, if we're going to have music in this digital format, how do we build business models that are now geared towards this world, right? I think that we saw that with Facebook. There's not that many companies actually pre-Facebook at scale that said, all I'm going to do is I'm going to aggregate a bunch of attention and I'm going to use personalized ad targeting, right? There were some, but there wasn't anywhere near what we see today. And it's the entrepreneurs eventually figure out how to monetize their businesses, right?
Yeah, the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, they decided that the kind of copying of media was an existential threat to them and went through every possible legal means to kind of shut all of that down. And what has come out of it is booming business for Spotify. And Pandora and a couple other competitors. They're still very angry about that because they're losing market share from the traditional incumbents. But it was an opportunity for new businesses who thought differently about how to provide that product to do so.
Recently, on the cryptocurrency side, we've seen economists come out and say, let's shut down crypto. We've seen now a congressman yesterday come out and say that we should outlaw crypto. As you think about, they're all focused on cryptocurrency, right? And so like the actual money aspect of this, because they're used to the financial markets, they see kind of power in America being disempowered on a global scale. They haven't yet, I think, caught on to this idea that the same aspects of the money, right, in the decentralized digital world is going to come to all aspects of business, right? So corporations, URLs, et cetera. How do you think those in power, right? The governments, the elected officials, they look at this. Is this something that they kind of, fight religiously? Do they embrace it? Like, what do you think that response looks like?
I mean, regulators have never been particularly strong when it comes to technology. They did a pretty terrible job with the internet back in the 90s. Still not doing a very great job with the internet. And I have said many times that I think that's where they're messing up the most now, right? Is just treating this as a money thing and spending so much time on who pays their taxes and how do we make sure that this is a commodity, security, or cash. Like, we are missing the fact that the fundamental fabric of networking technology may be changing. And we take for granted that the internet was developed mostly in the West, and that it has been a force for democracy. But that is not a guaranteed thing, and there are certainly other governments around the world that are pushing very strongly into this technology. And we need to not make this a bad place to investigate, not just crypto startups, but all sorts of decentralizing networks and systems that kind of transfer power back to quote unquote the people.
If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about crypto.
I like this. Where are we going with this?
and you could change one thing about crypto, decentralization, privacy, et cetera, right? So you can change or improve something. What's the one area that you would kind of wave that magic wand at?
I only get one thing.
Only one thing. Because there's a clock that's counting down, or we could talk forever.
I cannot. I'm too short, so I'm going to have to.
It's like 30 seconds left.
Oh, okay, great. I would make everyone understand that most people have, at least one job, maybe one or two kids, and probably not a lot of time to dig through GitHub tutorials. And that winning hearts and minds is not the way that you really kind of, quote unquote, win a revolution. But that we need to make tools that work for people where they are. Humans don't really change.
And so really what you're talking about there is just building things that people want to use and they don't even realize that they're getting the benefits of the decentralization underneath.
Yeah, I think that, we have to kill our idols a little bit, like cypherpunks, yay, but one of the biggest disservices that they did is mandate that everybody should learn how to code and that everybody should think like them. And they all kind of looked alike, so, why not? But if you want to build technology for the vast majority of humanity, we need to understand where those people are. Half of the global population is coming online in the next decade, and they have a very different idea about what computers should mean to them.
As I say, technology doesn't matter unless people use it. So thank you so much for doing this. Amber Baldet, everybody.
Thanks.